Well, let me start with you with that provocative comment. Perhaps I'll offer the first question to you, Kenton.
Okay.
And that is, do men have a role in passing on their nutritional history to their offspring?
Yes, thank you for the question. The question is, do men have a role in this? And the answer is definitely yes. So it turns out that the way nature works, that babies usually grow in the wombs of mothers. And because of that, mothers have a larger influence on the nutritional flow that flows from their body into the developing embryo and fetus. Nevertheless, there are several studies that now show that the diets of men can affect sperm epigenetically, and that can be passed on to their offspring. So we're guessing now an 80-20 effect, so that about 20% of the disease risk effect that comes from the developmental origins is set by men.
Interesting. Actually, let me ask you a follow-up question. What do you, as you provided your paradigm, what do you see as potential reward-focused interventions for obesity?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think the role of reward in our interventions for obesity is something we've only started to look at. So some of the most recent drugs, FDA-approved drugs for obesity, are reward-focused. So if you think of Contrave, it's got naltrexone in it, which is an opioid-focused drug that we've actually used in addiction in the past. One of the really tricky things about trying to target the reward system pharmacologically is that we need reward, right? We need to feel pleasure, we need to feel motivation, and so you want to very specifically target the places where reward has gone awry. So while I think pharmacology is an area that's really booming as we understand the reward system more, we're going to also need some kind of more behavioral approaches as well as kind of policy level approaches. So some very promising research that's happening on our response to food cues is these approach a bias modification programs. They're these very kind of basic behavioral science programs where you actually have people practice moving away from high-calorie food cues and towards lower-calorie food cues. And practicing this intervention, surprisingly, I find, is effective in reducing people's reactivity to food cues and has been found to aid people's weight loss interventions. But I think when I think of other diseases that are implicated in reward dysfunction, like addiction-related diseases, we've found that where we get the most public health benefit is a combination of improving individual treatments, but also improving the environment through policy that we're in. And so my lab, we look a lot at food marketing and how it activates the reward systems of teenagers and adolescents. And we're finding that the teenagers who are most prone to weight gain, that their brains are the most activated by junk food commercials relative to other sorts of commercials. There's so many cues in our environment, but marketing to children is one that we may be able to have some policy impact around to improve the role of food cues in our environment. But that's a future direction. Thanks
so much. Ron, I think you mentioned, and so did Jose, about sort of the role of the environment and genetics. So where do we actually stand on that now in terms of the contributions of genes and environment to the development of diseases like type 2 diabetes?
Well, I think Jose actually set the stage by pointing out that we all have a genetic background on which genes act to influence us, but the environment is the big current driver because genes aren't changing that fast. And epigenetics could change faster, but that's also another factor. So I think we know it is the environment. I think one of the things we don't really understand, and of course I think is really important, is what is it in the environment? We certainly know caloric density of foods and palatability of foods and high content of sugars and fats are there, but those are kind of the smoking guns that are obvious. And I think what we need to do is keep an open mind that there may be very strong contributors that are not so obvious, that are potentially non-nutritive additives to food or non-even food things that are winding up either being ingested. We know, for example, that this topic of the gut microbiome, which you introduced and I mentioned very briefly, is something which we're just now beginning to understand, and it not only can have impact on calories absorbed. These are the bacteria in the intestine that are involved in part of our digestive process and our gut maturation process, so they certainly can have impact on calories absorbed, but also even on developing precursors for the dopamine system. These kinds of neurotransmitters, many of their precursor molecules are actually derived by products of the gut microbiome. So I think that this is a new area. We don't really know its impact, and I don't think we even understand all the things that shape it. I will just comment about this, however, that this is also dependent on our genetics. So you take genetically identical animals and you put them in a certain environment, you get one thing, but if you use mice of different strains, you get very different results. So I think keeping this interaction in mind and understanding that will be a key to dissecting some of this complexity.
I'm glad you raised that about genetics, because it segues into a question I had for Jose, and that is, how does genomics compare to some of the other omics that we're hearing about, transcriptomics, epigenomics, proteomics, metabolomics, perhaps other omics only limited by economics. We're hearing more and more about these every year.
Lectionomics.
So why don't you just give us your sense on the advantages and disadvantages?
Yeah, so you know, we kind of stand on the threshold where all these different technologies are beginning to query the biological space in a fairly global manner, and you can get a sense of a cellular or organismal state even, whether it's the genes that are being expressed at any given time, so the transcriptomics, or the marks in the genome that tell you whether a gene is going to be on and off, epigenomics, metabolomics, so metabolites in serum that you can all capture in one single experiment, phenomics, you know, in terms of clinical risk factors that you get from electronic medical records, say, or cohorts. I think and all of them are useful and inform biology and this interplay between genes and environment. But I would say that one unique aspect of genomics, or several unique aspects of genomics, is that as opposed to all the other ways of capturing biology that are happening at any given state in time, and you don't know whether they're being influenced by disease or not, they co-associate with disease, and you don't know the causal direction. The gene variants are there at conception. So they're there before the organism develops, and so there is one direction of time. You can measure DNA variation once in the lifetime of an individual. It's stable, it's generally immutable, and it is not affected by the disease process. So you can then define that in some way it must be causal, either by itself or interaction with other factors, and you can use it to inform all the other omics, as I mentioned briefly in my remarks, as to that direction of effect. It can be comprehensive, it can be relatively cheap, done in very accessible, it's peripheral blood, and so even though it is not the only way in which we can understand these things, it can serve as a scaffold, the anchor, on which everything else can be built.
Thank you. We want to open up this discussion to the audience, so please, for those in the audience that have questions, please use the microphone, identify yourself. As you're moving to that, let me just ask one quick follow-up question to Ron. You showed on that nice slide about perhaps the relationship with insulin resistance and Alzheimer's disease, now considered perhaps type 3 diabetes. Diabetes accounts for 1 in 3 Medicare dollars expenditure, Alzheimer's disease 1 in 4, and so some better understanding of this. Obviously, it's imperative from an economic standpoint. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up, because I think that we heard in the opening lectures this morning about the long-range impact of both nutrition and obesity on public health as people get older and the community ages. And I just think that we still don't understand mechanistically all of these interactions. I would say that we've studied a lot about insulin action in the brain in both satiety centers and in cognitive centers, and others have studied this as well, and there's clearly an important interaction. But I do think it's important to think about the public health aspect of this in the following way, that if obesity and insulin resistance are really potential contributors to Alzheimer's, and I think they are potential contributors, think about what this generation of young people who are growing up with so much obesity and insulin resistance in their own population are going to be like when they're our age. They're going to be having been exposed to this for a long time. So I think that some of the aspects of this are really going to drive a lot of potential future risk for disease as well. And really, we don't know enough yet to know how to intervene, except to try to reduce the insulin resistance globally in a person, but not specifically, for example, with respect to the brain or the CNS.
Good. We have a number of questions here. Please.
Thank you. positive comments from the panelists. I want to focus on Dr. Gearhart's comments, which can be thought of as controversial. For example, when you talk about perhaps in obesity there is an increased sensitivity in the reward circuitry, where is the evidence, or is there evidence that it's not an increase in sensitivity, but a lack of or decreased restraint?
Great question. So is that the end of your question? I don't want to cut you off. Okay, if you have more, I'm happy to listen. So the question of, is this is a big question we struggle with. Is this more of like a bottom-up process where there's this sensitization of the reward system, this drive for food, or is this maybe a lack of kind of cognitive control, of restraint? And what we see is that those two systems communicate with one another, and that there's an interplay, a very complex interplay. What we've generally seen, if you look kind of at in adolescents who are at risk for obesity, before they're obese, that the biggest predictor of which of those adolescents are going to be most likely to gain weight and start to track towards obesity is less of the activation in their cognitive control systems and more in those kind of reward-related systems in the striatum. However, what we see is that individuals who perhaps have less effective cognitive control abilities are less able to dampen down that rewards response, making them more vulnerable to it. But then we see that interplay that if you have that really intense response to the food cues, the drive, you need more cognitive control to be able to try and reduce that. And so it's a dynamic system. I would say there's evidence for both pathways of cognitive control top-down and reward bottom-up. They interact, but I would say there's slightly more evidence early on of the reward bottom-up being the main driver. Thank you.
Thanks.
You've got it, absolutely.
Mike Wright.
Hi, I'm Judy Stern, University of California, Davis. And Dr. Rogers, I'd like to ask you a question. So you're head of the National Institutes of Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Disease, and it's fabulous. Given the importance of obesity, we know obesity is a disease. When will you be adding O to NIDDA?
I'm afraid, Dr.
An act of Congress.
It will literally take the act of Congress to do that. Dr. Collins is scheduled to be here later today, and so perhaps you could, but not to in any way belittle, or sort of undercut the question. Obesity is so important. It really is a driver, as you saw in that illustration. So many of the diseases, and across NIDDK, a number of those conditions are directly related to or contributed or exacerbated by the presence of obesity. And we really believe that fundamental understanding of the drive, but not everyone who's obese, by the way, develops those complications. So there is clearly something to be learned in doing more extensive phenotyping of people, not only who tend to develop these complications at lower BMIs, such as Asian Americans that we heard from the nice talk by Dr. Chan, but also understanding whether there are ways to intervene, either in the inflammatory process that we know is associated with it, the gut microbiota, and again, very intriguing area is this area of neurobiology of this. There are potential pathways yet to be uncovered, and we hope that this brain initiative really brings this to greater light in the role of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system in the development of obesity. I'll have to take the fifth, though, on adding something.
I just want to thank you because you have been a leader. I'm thrilled that you organized this panel, and I want to see it personally.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Frank Fiddles from Harvard Institute of Public Health. I have a question for Dr. Gerhardt. So I understand your point about the potentially addictive property of highly processed foods, and there is no question that could be one of the major practice of current obesity epidemic. However, some healthy eating patterns, for example, Mediterranean diet, traditional Mediterranean diet, was over valuable, highly palatable, contain high amount of fat, mostly from olive oil, very tasty, a lot of flavor, and high amount of fruits and vegetables and nuts. So I guess my question is, can you eat a healthy, can you be addicted to a healthy diet?
So you're pushing me today. I swore I wasn't going to say addiction and try and sidestep controversy. So that's an excellent question. We eat other foods that are calorie dense and palatable, and yet we don't see the same loss of control or potential override of our cognitive control systems, our satiety systems. And so what maybe, can you get addicted to those? That healthy diet, and what is it maybe about those sorts of foods that we do struggle with that differentiates them from the foods that we're less likely to struggle with? So I'll start with the question of whether we can get addicted to them. I think we don't know yet about what about the food or what types of foods are perhaps most prone to cause, or to maybe even if they cause, dysfunction in the reward system. We don't know whether it's necessarily palatability or calorie density. We do just see evidence that people will report liking those foods that you listed, but they don't seem to show the addictive-like phenotype in response to them. When we look at what we know about drugs of abuse, about what makes it addictive, is you have something that's potently rewarding, and you have a naturally high dose of it, and you have a quick speed of absorption and a quick crash. And when that happens, that spike and crash, that seems to be particularly likely to engage reward and motivation systems. My lab is looking a little bit at things like refined carbohydrates and glycemic load. So thinking of like an apple versus like a handful of gummy candies. You know, the dose of sugar in those are different, and the way that that sugar in the gummy candy isn't slowed down by things like water and fiber, it's going to cause this kind of quick spike and then crash in the blood sugar. And so there's evidence that it is early and emerging, and I don't think we're anywhere ready to say we know what it is, but that those kind of patterns of eating may make the reward system more prone to become sensitized in a way that drives forward future overeating. But early days.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this wonderful panel. I'm Claire Brendes with the Philip Barley Institute for Health Policy Studies at UC San Francisco. And my question pertains to the fact that America is very obsessed with a television show of Biggest Loser. We also know that there's some benefits with even modest reductions. And I was wondering if the panel members could give us the latest science on major weight loss and then regaining.
Well, I think that I'll make a couple of comments, but I'm not sure I'm able to answer your question specifically. But I would say that, first of all, the point you made is a very important point, which I think is important to make for our patients, and we do, which is that you don't necessarily have to get to normal weight to reverse and improve at least many of the metabolic derangements associated with obesity. And where individuals need to be is certainly individually different also. So getting individual patients to lose even a small percentage of their weight will often cause a very significant metabolic improvement. We also know that there are things that can be separated from just the absolute weight loss and the metabolic improvement, as, for example, when one compares bariatric surgery to similar weight loss induced by diet restriction, that there are probably additional gut factors that play a role and also lead to metabolic improvement. So I think that the answer, in part, I don't know about the Biggest Loser specifically in terms of their metabolic control, but I think that everybody benefits with weight loss. There's no doubt about that. And I think that somehow, or even weight control is a preventive. So I think that one of the things that I like to kind of come back to and stressing, though, is that therefore as a community, it's not just looking at healthier foods versus unhealthier foods, it's really looking also at total caloric intake, and we don't want to let our patients and our non-patient but potentially obese individuals think that as long as it's a healthy food, you can eat an unlimited quantity of it, because you know, a lot of things are healthy, but if you eat an unlimited quantity of them, you'll still gain weight. So we have to try to get this notion that portion size and portion control is still a big part of it, and you can eat a lot of things as long as you eat just a little of them.
Just wanted to add to that, maybe to put some quantitative numbers. So in the diabetes prevention program that we're familiar with, it was only about 10% weight loss that was targeted. So it's not the idea that you have an obese person, a person with obesity, and you try to help that person get to normal weight. Just losing 10% has a 62% risk reduction on diabetes incidence. So that's a huge effect on diabetes incidence with very modest weight loss achieved with modest exercise and with a dietary intervention. The other point was made earlier, and that is that any exercise, even in the absence of weight loss, is metabolically beneficial in terms of insulin sensitivity in muscle and in the disposal of glucose. So exercise by itself without weight loss is helpful. Third point from bariatric surgery is that we know that the beneficial effects on body metabolism happen before the onset of weight loss after the intervention. And there's an area of very active investigation that there is something about the rewiring of the gut and the way nutrients reach the gut and they are processed internally that leads to amelioration in the ability of the pancreatic beta cell to make insulin and to satisfy the metabolic demands that come from the ingestion of food at the time. So I think all of these things are very helpful. And maybe the fourth point to be made is that people who lose weight behaviorally dramatically tend to regain it. That there is some sort of set point that is individually determined. And you can maybe more or less toggle around that set point up and down a little bit, but any major thing typically leads to very, very high weight regain, and that can be psychologically devastating to the person.
Thanks. Yes.
Hi, I'm Katie Adamson with the YMCA of the USA, and we've been very involved in the diabetes prevention program. My question, though, to Dr. Flores is to continue that dialogue on physical activity. We've also been more recently involved in some interventions around early dementia and physical activity, some Parkinson's and physical activity, and pretty substantially cancer survivorship. So I want to know more about the dopamine effects and also just the insulin reaction effect from physical activity.
So this is to me, the dopamine, I think maybe Dr. Gerhardt should be the person. In terms of I am not very familiar with what are the changes in insulin sensitivity at the level of the brain from physical activity. I don't know, maybe Ron, you have.
I don't think it's really been looked at all that much yet.
Right. So, most of the ways in which we can determine insulin sensitivity in people in vivo are through hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamps. That is a total body assessment of insulin sensitivity. We can determine hepatic glucose disposal based on those methods. But I don't think there is a good technique to really get at whether things are different in the brain in people. And I don't know if there is neuron-sensitive insulin receptor knockouts.
Those certainly haven't been looked at in this context, but there are some very strong epidemiological clinical data that have been published now many years ago in The Lancet showing that activity levels, even within a normal range, strongly correlate with risk reduction for Alzheimer's disease in older adults. So people who have even a modest history of remaining active throughout their lives can have reduced Alzheimer's risk rates of more than 50%. So I think there is something to this. I don't think mechanistically we understand it, but I think there is something. Maybe Ashley can add to the mechanism.
Sure, I would say I don't have a huge depth of knowledge base on this one, but I do know that there's been at least some suggestive research that in particular aerobic physical activity seems to help the dopamine system repair, perhaps. So one thing you see potentially with consumption of a lot of high-calorie foods or obesity is D2 receptor downgrading. Possibly there's some controversial research on that. There seems to be that with physical aerobic activity that it can rebuild dopamine D2 receptors. So potentially kind of repairing perhaps the reward motivation system. The other piece that seems to be interesting interesting for me as well about the role of exercise is, again, aerobic exercise in brain imaging studies appears to diminish people's response to food cues in some circumstances. So if you get in a physically active regimen, it may, we don't exactly know the mechanism, may make you more able to maybe resist that cupcake or donut next time you see it.
I would just encourage more research. I mean, some of the folks we see walking in with Parkinson's walk in bent over and walk out straight up. And it's, Dr. Frieden said it's a wonder drug, and I just wish we would do more research on it.
If I can just follow up on that, if you looked at the cover of Time magazine about 3 weeks ago, you saw someone actually physically exercising. And exercise is known to actually have a number of beneficial effects, including improving insulin sensitivity, having effects in terms of cognition. There was a recent paper in PNAS that suggested it's mediated through the elaboration of cathepsin. But by and large, we really aren't aware of what these molecular transducers of the beneficial effects. And in fact, we just launched in this Time magazine piece talked about a common fund project that we're involved in, which will actually be done in patients with some studies in animal models to actually try to use a multi-omics approach to understand what are the beneficial transducers, the molecular transducers of both strength training as well as aerobic training to get a better understanding of that. So stay tuned to that. It's called Motor Pack. As I said, everything in the government has an acronym. Yes. Hey, David. How are you?
I wanted to first just offer clarification on a point and then ask a question. The clarification is we've heard several speakers say something along the lines of the obesity epidemic really started in 1970 or the last 30 years. And I think it's important to recognize, particularly like Thornberg's two comments, that in fact BMI levels have been increasing monotonically as have obesity levels for several hundred years, as voted by the data by Nobel laureate Robert Vogel and others. So it's been steadily going up. There was an inflection point in the obesity levels per se, defined as an arbitrary threshold and continued distribution, but that distribution was shifting for several hundred years. It started even earlier than that inflection point if you look at skin fold data as opposed to BMI data in the national needs data sets. The second clarification is about the idea that genetics aren't contributing. This is maybe a little bit of a pedantic point, but we're making, I think. While it's clear that genes have changed a lot in the last several hundred years, it is not clear that they haven't changed at all. Evolution is still going on. Data from the Framingham data set very clearly, as published in PNAS 3-5 years ago, showed that people reproduce at differential rates as a function of BMI. That changes the gene. A sort of debating for BMI occurs. That doesn't change allele frequencies, but it changes gene frequencies. So it's fairly clear probably that genes actually are contributing, though I would completely acknowledge they're a small contributor to the changes in the last generation or two relative to environmental changes. The question I wanted to ask Dr. Flores is about the interactions we showed with genetic risk and treatment. I thought that was a pretty interesting study. One of the things it points out is the ordinal interaction, meaning treatment was beneficial for everybody, as you know, but it was more beneficial for some, as opposed to a disordinal interaction in which you reverse the order of things such that treatment was good for some and poor for others. We've published some papers and done some calculations where it seems that when you have these kinds of ordinal interactions, they can be very useful if you adopt a kind of socialist view where you say there's a fixed pool of money to provide treatment to people, and we can only provide it to some people. So let's pick the people who get the most benefit. Even those small predictabilities are great from the pool point of view. But when you go to the individual physician point of view, or the individual patient or a person's point of view, they tend to have very little meaning. So it's still good for everybody. So I wonder about your comments and saying, well, we can get the treatment to the people that need it most. Doesn't that exclude all the people who also want it?
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, David. So very good points. I mean, I want to make it clear that I would never say that genes don't play a role. Okay, I mean, my whole career is based on that. So I'm just saying that for the point of view of individual risk prediction, it doesn't add a whole lot of information to use genetics, and that genetic changes haven't happened quickly enough to explain with the morass that we're in today. The other side of the coin is that the same way that environment drove a pandemic, then we can modify the environment. We're not doomed by our genes to be obese and diabetic, but we can actually turn the tide. In terms of your second point is exactly on target. So the idea here is that, of course, lifestyle modification would be beneficial to the whole population, not just for diabetes, but for cardiovascular risk and so on. And so you should be able to deploy it across the board. The point is that the individual nutritionist and the individual trainer that were part of the diabetes prevention program intervention, or done as a group in the YMCA deployment at the national level, is incredibly expensive. And so in an era of finite resources, as you say, if you had to start somewhere, you might as well start with the people who are most likely to benefit. And that is sort of at the heart of precision medicine, is that even though something is beneficial for all, you can get more bang of your buck for one people if that buck is finite. But I completely agree with you that if you could deploy it across the entire population would benefit.
Albert.
Albert Reese from the University of Maryland. A quick comment and a question, I think we'll listen to Dr. Thornburg, that Conrad could also respond. Clearly, as you've described the Barker hypothesis, so David Barker's proposal regarding adult diseases having their origins in utero, and have explained that, at least in part, it may be associated with insulin resistance. Likewise, Dr. Khan shared with you again the relatedness of insulin resistance and a series of disorders. The question is, should we be using insulin sensitizers more prophylactically as opposed to relying on its therapeutic role? Do you believe that there's a role for using insulin sensitizers in patients, for example, fetuses, infants that were born at 3 pounds, 2 pounds, 1.5 pounds, and clearly are at high risk for those adult diseases? Should they be put on sensitizers earlier? And likewise, Dr. Khan, should we be using it more liberally as opposed to in a therapeutic role only?
So I can answer first by saying that there's no doubt that the way you grow before you're born will alter your insulin sensitivity later in your life. That we know for sure. What we don't know is what that means is it makes you vulnerable for being insulin resistant later. What we don't know, though, is whether or not that can be abrogated by changes in lifestyle or even diet in early life. So my view would be that before we go to the medical answer, we might try to see whether or not there are ways that lifestyle and diet could change that before we use medicine. But that would just be my initial take.
Right. So, yeah, this is an interesting question in a number of ways. I would start off by saying that in many studies funded by NIDDK and other institutes, it's very clear that our major preventive or delaying approach for diseases like type 2 diabetes are, in fact, disease interventions that work on insulin resistance, but they're lifestyle interventions as opposed to pharmacologic interventions. So we know that modest exercise, modest dietary restriction have very beneficial effects, and it's also illustrated even in the study that Jose showed looking at the genetics. The intervention there was a lifestyle intervention that was really going to mainly affect insulin sensitivity. So we know that this is definitely beneficial. And I'll just mention one little factoid, which I think really shows how impactful it can be, which sort of links our two talks, is many years ago there was a study at the Joslin looking at offspring of type 2 diabetic parents for diabetes risk. And the number sort of came out that 50% of the offspring, if you had 2 type 2 diabetic parents, 50% of their offspring became diabetic by age of 50 if they had had both parents. But you could reduce that risk from 50% to 7% if you remained normal weight. So, so there's this, again, huge effect of body weight to drive insulin resistance and things to reduce it. Now, there's a lot of interest now in insulin sensitizers, particularly metformin is being touted for its potentially beneficial effects, not just in improving diabetes and obesity risk, where it doesn't really have such a great effect, but in improving longevity and other potential beneficial effects. My feeling is that the data are still not there to get a clinical recommendation. What I do think we need, and I think which is occurring a little more, is actually a prospective clinical trials to look at the use of insulin sensitizers like metformin for this purpose. But I will say that metformin is not really a classic working as a classic insulin sensitizer. It's improving hepatic metabolism. It's not really improving insulin sensitivity in other tissues. And so I think that our search for more appropriate and more potent and useful insulin sensitizers really needs to continue to really address the question you're asking about pharmacology. And it needs to be done in a clinical trial basis, not yet as a global health recommendation.
If we can just add quickly to that. So metformin has been used effectively for diabetes prevention in the DPP. It is not approved by the FDA for diabetes prevention, but it is used off-label for that purpose. And not only is it cost effective, it actually cost savings when you do the economic analysis. So there is a drive to try to change the FDA label for metformin as the first medication for diabetes prevention, which a modest effect on insulin sensitivity. The other point to be made, and where genetics can be helpful, is that when babies are born small for gestational age, it could be because of epigenetic mechanisms and maternal starvation and so on, but it can also be because they are enriched for genetic variants that decrease beta cell function and lead to less insulin. So insulin is a growth factor in utero. You have a lot of insulin, you become big as a baby, so that's why maternal diabetes can actually lead to macrosomia, because the baby is responding to maternal glucose by making a lot of insulin and growing because of that insulin. So by the same token, you can be enriched for genetic variants that actually make you a poor insulin secretor, and then be born small for gestational age and be at future risk for diabetes. So insulin sensitization would not necessarily be the paradigm in that setting.
As a chair, unfortunately, I have to take the prerogative. My mission is to start on time and end on time, and I see the red light flashing. I think the members on the stage will be present during lunch, and so there might be some pressing questions that could be addressed one-on-one. But with this, let me thank my panelists. Thank you so much.